Hello and welcome to this Algeris YouTube video on hazards, risk and the hierarchy of control. If you find this video useful, please click the like button to help our channel, and if you want to be the first to see our video once they are released, click subscribe and hit the alert button. As you can imagine, the term hazard or hazardous is spoken often in health and safety, as does the term risk. These two terms go hand in hand, but they're not the same. Put simply, a hazard is something with the potential to cause harm. So when we say hazard, what do we immediately think of? A trailing cable, a chemical, a heavy box? But what makes them a hazard? How can they cause you harm? If you tripped over a trailing cable, you could sprain your hand or foot, or maybe even break a bone. For the chemical, how can they cause you harm? It could be a corrosive substance or even a carcinogenic. And with a heavy box, how could that cause you harm? Depending on the weight and your strength and other factors, it may lead to back strain or a hernia. For a hazard to cause harm, a hazardous event must occur. That is when someone interacts with the hazard. That trailing cable is causing no harm until someone comes into contact with it. For example, they're not watching where they're going and they trip over the cable. For the chemicals, that hazardous event could be a worker decanting a large bottle into a smaller bottle. The bottle funnel tips and the worker isn't wearing the correct PPE. Maybe they receive skin burns from the corrosive substance. And the heavy box. Someone comes to lift it not realising its weight. Until the hazardous event occurs, the hazard causes no harm. Finally, hazards can be categorised into different types. These are physical, so slips, trips, fire, electricity; chemical hazards, corrosive such as acids or alkalis; biological, virus, bacteria; psychosocial, violence to staff, workplace stress; and mechanical, entanglement in machines or other mechanical hazards. It is often useful to categorise hazards, and this will help to ensure that you have covered the obvious hazards, such as slips and trips, in addition to the not so obvious or hidden hazards, such as biological viruses. So now that we have covered what is a hazard, we need to look at the term risk. So what is risk? How do we measure it? Crucially, how do we reduce it? When we think about risk, we have to think of what is the likelihood of coming into contact with a hazard? And if we were to come into contact with a hazard, what would the consequence be? Let's use a trailing cable as an example. Trip hazards such as trailing cables are common hazards found in almost all workplaces. Imagine you have a trailing cable in an office server room. Employees rarely go in there, and if they do, it's only one person, the IT manager. The room is locked unless he or she has to go in to fix the problem. How likely is it that someone is going to come into contact with that trailing cable? Realistically, probably not that often. We'll give the likelihood in this case a low. Now let's consider if that trailing cable was causing a trip hazard in the reception of your busy office building. People are passing in and out of the building all the time. Maybe staff use it as an entrance and exit. You also have visitors and contractors entering and leaving the building by the reception door. Do you think it would be fair to say that with a higher footfall in the area, there is a higher likelihood someone may trip up? In this case, we will give the likelihood a high. Now on to consequence. How do we measure consequence? Let's go back to that trailing cable. Think about the consequence of someone tripping over a cable. It could be bruising, maybe a sprained ankle or wrist if they fall on a flat surface. Whilst this is not a minor laceration, it's also not as severe as a fatality, so we could assign the consequence as medium. Now we have our likelihood and consequences assigned. We can calculate the risk rating. Go to your risk matrix and see if that is an acceptable level of risk. If it is not, you must implement control measures to reduce the risk. It is not always possible to reduce risk to zero. There is an element of risk involved in all aspects of life, even crossing the road. However, as an employer, you have a duty to measure and, where possible, reduce risk to your employees and others affected by your works. So how do we reduce risk? We know we need to reduce risk, but how do we do it? If risk is a combination of likelihood and consequence, then to reduce risk, we can either reduce the likelihood, reduce the consequence, or ideally, reduce both. How do you do that, you ask? By implementing risk measures using the hierarchy of controls. Now that we have looked at hazards and risks, We now need to think about what we can do about them, and that is what we consider when we look at the hierarchy of controls. What comes to mind when you think of a hierarchy? The structure of an organisation, a top to bottom order? Well, that's what we need to consider when we look at the hierarchy of controls. The hierarchy of controls is designed to help us prioritise risk controls. As you can see, we have eliminate at the top, meaning eliminating the hazard. With PPE, safe systems of work and training at the bottom. Why do you think that is? Why would we look to eliminate a hazard first? Surely giving everyone PPE would be easier and cheaper. The answer is quite simple. If we eliminate the hazard, there is no hazard for workers or anyone else to interact with. We only want to rely on PPE, safe systems of work and training as a last resort. Such control measures rely solely on the employees to wear the PPE correctly, maintain it, or follow their training and safe systems of work. Unfortunately, people are forgetful, people get complacent, or on occasion, people cut corners. Therefore, those controls are less reliant on people, are stronger than those that are. Let's go through the controls in a little more detail, starting with eliminating the hazard. Do you think this is always possible? Think about a machine in a manufacturing or engineering workplace. If you were to remove the machine to eliminate its associated hazards, what effect would that have on the business? We must consider the term reasonably practicable when implementing risk controls. That's the time, cost and effort to reduce the risk versus the benefit in risk reduction. If a machine is key in manufacturing your product, it may not be possible to eliminate it completely. Therefore, what else can we do to reduce the risk of coming into contact with hazards? If elimination is not possible, our next action is to substitute the process for a less hazardous alternative. For example, instead of using a ladder for working at height, use a mobile elevated work platform such as a cherry picker, which would reduce the likelihood of a fall as it is generally more stable. However, think again about a machinery hazard. Substitution may not always be possible. Therefore, we look to engineering controls such as isolating the hazard, which may be more practicable. Isolating the hazard by fitting a fixed guard to a blade or fixing a cage around a machine will allow the machine to operate but prevent contact with hazardous parts of the machinery. So just to recap, eliminate and substitute are engineering controls, risk control measures that rely less on people to follow safe systems of work or wear PPE. Finally, we need to consider administrative controls and PPE. Our last options when determining controls, not invalid by any means, but not to be solely relied upon to reduce risk. Administrative controls are systems such as health and safety procedures, method statements, and permit to work systems. These are designed to ensure employees follow the safest determined methods in conducting an activity to keep them and others safe. Lastly, PPE or personal protective equipment. As mentioned earlier, this should be the last resort as we are only protecting the wearer and it relies on the behaviour of employees to wear it when they are supposed to. However, if you have exhausted all other controls, then PPE definitely has its place and is better than no controls. Think about your workplace. What risk controls do you use? Elimination, substitution, isolation, safe systems of work, PPE? You will probably find you use a combination of risk controls to reduce risks in the environment. There you have it, the hierarchy of controls. Comment below what combination of risk controls you use in your workplace. And click subscribe to be the first to see our new videos when they go live. If you've not seen them already, we have more videos like this one on our YouTube page, including how to carry out a risk assessment and topics around CDM. Thanks for watching.